The Grand Oak stood like a beacon of elegance amidst the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles, its freshly renovated facade glowing under the soft hum of Friday evening traffic. Inside, the dining room shimmered with opulence, walls paneled in dark walnut, chandeliers dripping with crystal, and tables draped in crisp white linens that caught the flicker of candlelight. The air buzzed with the chatter of the city's elite. Young tech entrepreneurs in tailored suits clinked glasses of overpriced Cabernet, their laughter sharp and confident. Social media influencers angled their phones to capture desserts adorned with edible gold flakes, their faces lit by the glow of screens. At the far end, a silver-haired couple, heirs to an old oil fortune, sipped martinis in quiet ritual, their weekly tradition unbroken for decades. Amid this sea of wealth and pretense sat a man who seemed entirely out of place. He occupied a small corner table near the kitchen doors, a spot most patrons avoided for its proximity to the clatter of plates and the occasional waft of steam. His attire was unremarkable. A faded gray polo shirt, slightly wrinkled from wear, paired with khaki slacks that bore the faint creases of a long day. In his hand, he cradled a tumbler of the house whiskey, the cheapest on the menu. A modest $12 pour in a place where cocktails routinely topped $30. He sipped it slowly, his weathered fingers tracing the glass's edge, his posture relaxed yet deliberate. To the untrained eye, he was just another aging customer, perhaps a retiree splurging on a rare night out. But the veteran staff knew better. 6 months earlier, Clint Eastwood had walked into the Grand Oak, not as a guest, but as its savior. The restaurant, a fixture of LA's dining scene for half a century, had fallen on hard times when its founder's son, overwhelmed by debts and disinterested in the family legacy, put it up for sale. Clint, then 94, had heard the news through an old friend in the industry. He didn't hesitate. With a handshake and a wire transfer, he'd taken ownership, his name buried in layers of paperwork to keep the purchase quiet. The staff had been stunned. The man whose gravelly voice and steely gaze had defined decades of cinema was now their boss. Yet Clint had given them one firm directive: treat me like anyone else when I come in. No fuss, no special treatment. I'm here to see what you're made of. And so, every Friday, he arrived unannounced, slipping into that corner table to watch. For Clint, the Grand Oak wasn't about its polished veneer or Michelin aspirations. It was about something deeper, something he'd learned long ago in dusty diners and roadside bars. A place's worth lay in how it treated the unnoticed, the ordinary. Tonight, as the room pulsed with privilege, he sat in silence, waiting to see if that spirit still lived within these walls, or if it too had been polished away. The Grand Oak's dining room hummed with the rhythm of a well-oiled machine, but beneath the polished surface, a storm was brewing. Rachel Bennett, the newest addition to the waitstaff, moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who believed she belonged among the elite. At 25, she was fresh from a top-tier hospitality school in San Francisco, her diploma still crisp in its frame back home. Her Instagram bio boasted future food influencer, and she'd already amassed a modest following by posting artful shots of Grand Oak's signature dishes: truffle-dusted scallops, foie gras terrin, anything that screamed luxury. Tonight, her phone rested in her apron pocket, ready to capture the next viral moment. But her eyes kept darting to the corner table, where the man in the gray polo sat, nursing his whiskey with maddening patience. Rachel had noticed him an hour into her shift, and each glance fueled her irritation. His attire grated against her vision of what Grand Oak should be: a playground for the stylish, the connected, the worthy. She'd spent the evening fawning over a table of tech brothers in slim-fit blazers, refilling their wine with a practiced smile while mentally drafting captions for their $200 entrees. Meanwhile, the old man in the corner seemed to mock her efforts, his presence a stubborn stain on her curated aesthetic. She muttered to herself as she polished a wine glass, Who wears that to a place like this?" Her tone carried the disdain of someone who'd spent years studying the art of exclusivity, only to see it undermined by a $12 whiskey and a wrinkled shirt. Across the room, Miguel Torres balanced a heavy bus tub, his arms taut from hours of clearing plates. At 19, he was the youngest on staff, an immigrant from Oaxaca who'd crossed the border 2 years ago with his mother's prayers and a single suitcase. The Grand Oak was his lifeline, its wages keeping his family afloat back home. He moved with quiet efficiency, his dark eyes scanning the room for spills or empty glasses. But tonight, those eyes lingered on the man in the polo. Miguel knew him, not from a social scene, but from grainy VHS tapes he'd watched with his father in their cramped living room. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Unforgiven. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a face to Miguel. He was a symbol of grit, of standing tall when the world pushed you down. The boy's hands tightened around the tub as he stole another glance, a flicker of pride in his chest. Rachel, oblivious to Miguel's reverence, decided she'd had enough. She smoothed her apron, squared her shoulders, and strode toward Clint's table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down to confrontation. The veteran staff, a bartender with 20 years behind the counter, a hostess who'd seen the place through 3 owners, exchanged wary looks. They knew the routine. Clint's visits were a test, and Rachel was about to fail it spectacularly. She stopped at his table, hands on hips, her smile thin and artificial. "Sir," she began, her voice syrupy with false courtesy. "I couldn't help but notice you've been here a while, just sitting with that drink." Clint looked up, his hazel eyes meeting hers with a calm that unnerved her. He took a slow sip, the ice clinking softly in the glass, and said nothing. Rachel pressed on, her tone sharpening. "This table's usually reserved for our dying guests. We've got a big party coming in soon. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at the bar." Clint set the glass down, his movements unhurried. "I'm fine here," he replied, his voice low and steady, the same timbre that had once silenced outlaws on screen. Rachel's smile faltered, a crack in her polished veneer. She glanced at her watch, then at the Tech brothers waiting by the host stand, their Rolexes glinting under the lights. "Suit yourself," she said, her words clipped, "but this isn't exactly a dive bar." The insult hung in the air, and Miguel, clearing a nearby table, froze, his pulse quickening. The room didn't know it yet, but the fuse had been lit. The Grand Oak's dining room, once a symphony of clinking glasses and murmured boasts, fell into an uneasy hush as Rachel's words sliced through the air. "This isn't a dive bar," she'd said, her voice edged with a venom she no longer bothered to mask. Clint Eastwood sat motionless, his whiskey glass resting on the table, the faint amber liquid catching the chandelier's glow. His face remained unreadable, but a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, that half-smile known to millions from Dirty Harry and Gran Torino, hinted at something brewing beneath the surface. Rachel, emboldened by his silence, took it as surrender. She straightened up, her chin tilting with the arrogance of youth, and prepared to deliver the final blow. "Listen, sir," she said, her tone rising enough to turn heads at nearby tables. "Our chef's menu isn't cheap, and this isn't the kind of place where you sit for hours with a bottom-shelf drink. We've got standards here. Maybe in your day, people could just wander in looking like that, but times have changed." She gestured dismissively at his polo shirt, her manicured nails flashing in the light. "This is the Grand Oak, not some roadside joint off the 405. If you're not eating, you're taking up space for real customers." The room tensed. A young influencer paused mid-selfie, her gold-flecked dessert forgotten. The silver-haired couple at the next table shifted in their seats, the husband's jaw tightening as he leaned forward, only to be stilled by his wife's gentle hand on his wrist. She recognized the look in Clint's eyes, a quiet storm, the kind that had preceded every showdown in his films. "Thomas," The manager hovered near the bar, his face paling as he realized he'd misjudged the distance to Clint's table. He started weaving through the crowd, but it was too late. The match had struck. Miguel stood frozen 10 feet away, the bus tub trembling in his hands. Rachel's words burned in his ears, not just the insult to Clint, but the way she dismissed his world. The roadside joints where his father had taught him to dream over lukewarm coffee and pirated DVDs. He took a step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Rachel, maybe you shouldn't." "Stay out of it, Miguel," she snapped, whipping around so fast her apron strings fluttered. "Go stack plates or whatever it is you do. This doesn't concern you." Her eyes flashed with contempt, and Miguel recoiled, the tub slipping slightly in his grip. But Clint's gaze flicked to the boy, a flicker of interest crossing his weathered features. He'd seen something in Miguel's faltering courage, a spark he recognized from his own early days. Rachel turned back to Clint, her patience evaporating. "Look, I've tried being nice. You clearly don't get it. This isn't some set for one of your old cowboy movies. This is a prestigious establishment, and I won't let you ruin the vibe for people who actually belong here." Her voice cracked with exasperation, loud enough now that even the Tech brothers by the host stand lowered their phones, their smirks fading into curiosity. The bartender, a grizzled man named Hank who'd poured drinks for Clint decades ago, muttered under his breath, "Oh, kid, you've done it now." Clint set his glass down with a deliberate slowness that seemed to stretch time itself. The soft clink of glass on wood echoed louder than it should have, a signal that silenced the room more effectively than Rachel's outburst. He leaned back in his chair, one eyebrow arching slightly, and repeated her words in a low, gravelly drawl. "My old cowboy movies, huh?" The question hung there, heavy with irony, and a few older patrons exchanged knowing glances. They'd seen the look before, the calm before the reckoning. Rachel, oblivious to the shift, doubled down. "Yeah, your day, when people could just stumble into anywhere, order the cheapest thing, and act like they owned the place. This is about modern luxury now, for people who respect what we've built here." She waved a hand toward the influencers, who nodded uncertainly, caught between their screens and the unfolding drama. "You're pretending to fit in, and it's embarrassing." The word pretending landed like a gauntlet. Thomas reached the edge of the scene, his tie askew, his mouth opening to intervene. But Clint raised a hand, a subtle gesture that stopped him cold. The old man reached into his pocket, pulled out a battered flip phone, and flipped it open with a practiced flick of his wrist. "Jerry," he said into it, his voice steady as steel, "bring me the ownership papers. And those renovation sketches we talked about last week. Now." He snapped the phone shut and set it beside his whiskey, his eyes locking onto Rachel's with an intensity that made her falter. "You think I'm pretending," he said, his tone quiet but commanding, the kind that had once ordered men to drop their guns on screen. Interesting choice of words. Rachel's bravado wavered, her order pad slipping in her sweaty grip. The room held its breath as Jerry, a wiry accountant with a leather portfolio under his arm, emerged from the back office, his steps brisk but measured. He nodded at Clint, handed over the documents, and stepped back, a faint grin tugging at his lips. Clint opened the portfolio, revealing a stack of legal papers stamped with notary seals. He slid them across the table toward Rachel, who stared at them as if they might bite. "6 months ago," he began, his voice cutting through the silence, "I bought this place. Not for the chandeliers or the truffle oil, but for what it used to stand for. I've been coming here every Friday since, sitting right here, watching. Want to know why?" Rachel's face drained of color, her knees buckling slightly as the weight of her mistake crashed down. Miguel dropped his bus tub with a deafening clatter, the sound ricocheting off the walls. The older couple gasped, the husband whispering, "I knew it." The Tech brothers gaped, one fumbling to record the moment. Clint leaned forward, his half-smile gone, replaced by a gaze that pinned Rachel where she stood. "Because I own the Grand Oak," he said, each word a hammer strike. "And you just told your boss he doesn't belong?" The Grand Oak stood frozen, the air thick with the aftermath of Clint Eastwood's revelation. Rachel's order pad slipped from her fingers, landing with a soft thud on the hardwood floor. Her eyes darted between the ownership papers and Clint's unrelenting gaze, her carefully constructed world crumbling under the weight of her own words. The Tech brothers by the host stand whispered furiously, one still filming, while the older couple nodded in quiet approval, as if they'd expected this all along. Miguel, his bus tub abandoned, stood wide-eyed, his breath shallow with a mix of awe and relief. Thomas, the manager, hovered uselessly, his hands wringing his tie into knots. Clint leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, the legal papers spread before him like a judge's gavel. His voice, when it came, was softer now, but no less commanding, the gravelly timbre of a man who'd spent a lifetime teaching lessons through action, not anger. 50 years ago, he began, his eyes drifting past Rachel to the room beyond. I walked into this place for the first time. Wasn't anybody then, just a kid with a few bucks and a shirt not much better than this one. He tugged at his polo's collar, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Old man Thompson, the owner, didn't care. He poured me a drink, sat me down, and treated me like I was the governor of California. Not because of who I was, but because that's how he ran things. Dignity, respect, for everybody. The room listened, rapt. Even the influencers lowered their phones, caught in the pull of his story. Rachel swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she clasped them in front of her apron. Clint's gaze returned to her, steady and unyielding. When his son wanted to sell 6 months ago, I stepped in. Not for the fancy lights or the $50 steaks. I could get those anywhere. I bought it to keep that spirit alive. A place where a man in a polo shirt or a kid bussing tables gets the same nod as some hotshot in a suit. He paused, letting the words settle, then gestured toward Miguel. This boy tried to stop you. Not because he's nosy, but because he gets it. He knows respect isn't about what's on your back or in your wallet. Miguel straightened, his cheeks flushing with pride, though his eyes stayed locked on the floor. Clint turned back to Rachel, his tone gentling but firm. I could fire you right now, and nobody blink. But that's not what this place is about. So here's your choice. Walk out that door and find a job where modern luxury means something to you. Or stay here and learn from Miguel, from Hank, from the folks who've kept this place running for decades. Learn what real service means. Your call. Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears, her bravado shattered. She glanced at Miguel, then at the veteran staff watching silently. Hank at the bar, the hostess by the door, their faces a mix of pity and expectation. I'd like to stay, she whispered, wiping her cheek with a shaky hand. If you'll let me, sir. Clint nodded, finishing his whiskey with a slow sip. Good choice. Thomas, put Miguel in charge of showing her the ropes. He's earned it. Thomas stammered a yes, sir, while Miguel's head snapped up, disbelief melting into a grin. The older couple began to clap, a soft sound that spread through the room, not for Clint's fame, but for the lesson he'd carved into the night. The Grand Oak exhaled, its heart beating anew. Months later, the Grand Oak thrived, its reputation burnished not by its crystal chandeliers or gilded desserts, but by a quiet integrity that lingered in the air. Rachel had traded her Instagram obsession for a notepad of handwritten tips from Miguel and Hank, her smile now genuine as she greeted guests in jeans or tuxedos alike. Miguel, promoted to waiter, moved through the dining room with a confidence born of respect earned, not demanded. He'd sent his first paycheck home with a note, for Papa, from the Grand Oak. Clint still came every Friday, slipping into his corner table with the same gray polo and khaki slacks, his whiskey order unchanged. He watched the staff with that familiar half-smile, his presence a silent anchor. The regulars knew him now, but they honored his rule. No fuss, no fanfare. To them, he wasn't just a legend of the screen. He was the man who'd reminded them that class wasn't in the price of a meal, but in the way you served it. On a quiet evening, as the city glittered beyond the windows, Clint raised his glass to the room, a toast to a place where dignity outshone decadence, where an old value lived on, steady as his gaze.